Welcome to the Victory Groove podcast. I'm your host, Eli Jones, and this is the podcast that helps you conquer the giants that we all face in life. Just as David faced Goliath confidently, knowing God was on his side, you also can face your giants, knowing that you already hold the keys to victory. Today, we are really excited to have one of our partners here. I'm going to start with Ben Wiggins, a podcast architect. And as you well know, Ben is a close friend, and we've been working together for a while. He's done the Mastercast at Maze. Ben, we're happy to have you. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. He and I are going to co-host today, and we're welcoming our friend Chris Field. Now, Chris Field has a long resume. I'm going to try to hit a few highlights. Chris has been challenging complacency and disrupting the status quo most of his life. His most important disruption is Mercy Project, the nonprofit he started to rescue children from human trafficking in Ghana, Africa. Its innovative approach has drawn international attention and earned the prestigious Norman Borlaug Humanitarian Award. To date, Mercy Project has rescued more than 150 children, returned them to their families, and provided them with education that will transform their future for generations to come. Field lives in College Station, Texas, with his beautiful wife, Stacy, and their 4 young children. Welcome, Chris. Glad to have you today.
Thank you so much. It's honestly a great pleasure and joy to be here with you, so thanks.
Yeah, so happy to have you. You know, I've been reading a lot about you, and I would encourage folks to Google Chris Field. There's a lot out there, but I'm most interested in this right now, Chris. What is this? You wrote most viral ice cream reviews in history of the internet. Now, that's a big deal.
Yeah. You know, of all the things you could, I guess, become famous for, that one feels pretty unimportant, but it does make for great stories. So I love ice cream. I have always been a big fan of ice cream. So a few years ago, any of your listeners that are here in Texas, where I'm based and where I know you and Ben are based, will be familiar with Bluebell ice cream, which is kind of a Southern delicacy. And just, you know, located 45 minutes from College Station is the original Bluebell Creamery. And so just a few years ago, just for fun, whenever Bluebell would come out with a new flavor, I would just write a little review, a little silly, tongue-in-cheek something. And I did this a few times, and you know, people seemed to get a kick out of it. It would have a 500 shares or 1,000 shares. I mean, people were enjoying it. It was fun to do, and then they came out with this flavor that people may be familiar with called Christmas cookies. And you know, this was like a big new flavor for Bluebell. They'd never done anything like this before. I mean, it was really out there. And so I had a lot of fun on the review. I mean, it's a topic, and there's so many Christmas theme things that you can do. And so I wrote this little review, just like I'd done on the other ones, and kind of, you know, threw it out to the world like you do on social media. And the next thing I knew, it was, you know, thousands of people, and then tens of thousands of people. I think it ended up getting shared something like 70,000 times, and 2-3 million people, they estimate. Wow. People who do this sort of thing estimate that it reached 2 to 3 million people. It was featured in the Houston Chronicle. Yeah. It was ended up allowing me to go down and meet the CEO of Bluebell, who ended up endorsing my first book. So it was a fun, silly little thing. And I think a good reminder that in a world that sometimes takes itself too seriously, all of us are looking for ways to be more joyful and to smile.
That's right. Yeah, very, very good. Good. Wow. I'm going to have to look up that review. That's just amazing. Just amazing. And you mentioned that, I guess it was the Cruzy family, right? That, you know, was it Paul that endorsed your book?
Yeah. So Ricky Dixon, who was the first non-Cruzy to be CEO of Bluebell in the company's history, or the first non-family. He was actually VP of marketing and then moved into that CEO role. So it was Ricky that ended up endorsing the book.
Yeah, good. And that's Disrupting for Good. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that was my first book. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Tell us a little bit about the book, Disrupting for Good. Using passion and persistence to create lasting change. I like that.
Yeah, so that book really came about when a friend of mine sent me an email one day, and he had seen that at the University of Southern California, they had a new degree in disruption. It was a bachelor's degree in disruption. And he said, hey, this made me think about you, this idea of looking at how things are, but really asking how they could be. And it was sort of in that moment that I just had this moment of clarity. I thought, well, you know what? That's actually what I've been doing all these years. Like, I never had a name for it. And when I was in junior high and high school, I can assure you it wasn't a positive connotation, but this idea of looking at not how things are, but how they could be, and really how things should be, that really, it felt like that, just that simple email from my friend Chris White, it felt like it just kind of gave me a new name. And I felt like I all of a sudden understood myself a little bit better. I was like, oh, that's what I'm a disruptor. Like that's what I've been doing all these years. And so I really became infatuated with this idea of disruption. And I found Clay Christensen's work, the Harvard professor. And of course, his work was all around disruptive innovation, but only in the business context, how a new technology would come in and completely disrupt the business or an entire industry. But what's interesting is that Christensen's work never really got outside of business. And so what I found was that business people were kind of over the word disruption. They felt like it was overdone. But then no other industry had ever really talked about what it would look like to be disrupted. So the nonprofit space, the ministry space, the education space, like nobody else, it had never gotten to those other spaces. So business people were like, oh, disruption. Again, it's just so cliche. And everybody else was like, ooh, disruption. That sounds interesting. So I was like, wow, this is crazy. So I began to really dig in, and I wanted to find out, who are those disruptors? Because by the time we find a disruption, like, look, you take somebody like Elon Musk, right? And there's all this stuff now on Tesla and SpaceX and all that. Like, you can read all that and it's fine, but it almost feels, for the vast majority of us who are just ordinary people, it feels out of reach for us. I mean, Elon Musk's brain is like, it's on a different level. And it feels like, and by the time you see the successes, he's so far down the road that the path from where he started and where he is, just it feels impossible to us. And so it doesn't really motivate us. It actually kind of demotivates us. Because like, oh yeah, I could never do that. I thought, that's easy with these famous people, but like, who are just these ordinary people who disrupted? Like the person you're grabbing produce next to at the grocery store, the person sitting next to you at the stoplight, or the person whose kid is swinging next to yours on the playground at school. Like, who are the ordinary people whose names we've never heard, who saw something the way it was and decided to make it something different? So I went out and I sought these stories. And that's what the whole first book is, stories of ordinary disruptors who saw something that was happening and decided that they were uncomfortable with the way that it was. And so they created a new and better truth than what existed before. So that's really the premise of the first book. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Amazing. So, part of what we do here at Victory Group is we talk about how some people will have these sometimes traumatic things that will happen to them. And then we take that energy and we put it into something for good, something that could help others. And your book is Disrupting for Good. And so does that lead us into the whole Mercy Project? Is that how you were thinking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mercy Project is my most important disruption, certainly. I had little disruptions along the way. I ran for mayor of my hometown when I was 19 years old. I had the chance to break 4 Guinness World Records, taught a class in your business school, even though I didn't formally have a background in business. And so I had these moments of disruption, but none of them as significant or important as the work of Mercy Project, which started with me finding an uncomfortable truth, which was reading a book about children who were trafficked into the fishing industry in Ghana, Africa, sold as child slaves. And then that led to Googling the author's name, finding her phone number, calling her, showing up in Ghana with her 3 months later to meet the children myself, which led to me quitting my job 9 months later. I was a pastor. Then I started Mercy Project, even though I had no idea what I was doing. And then just beginning to walk this road of justice and mercy, of freedom, of hope, of new life, and really trying to figure out some of my own life, even as I was trying to walk alongside these children and their families on this journey for them to be free as well. And so certainly when I wrote Disrupting for Good a few years ago, I was very aware that in some ways that was the story of Mercy Project, was how did we use passion? How did we use persistence to create lasting change? And that's a huge passion of mine, by the way, is in the nonprofit space, which I've been in most of my entire life, either ministry or nonprofit. And we've got this real, I think, problem that the complexity of our solutions rarely matches the complexity of the problems we're trying to solve. And then we seem surprised when things don't work, or we get frustrated that our simpleton solutions aren't sustainable. And I really think that a new era is coming, and I hope we'll continue to move into this, but where the world between for-profit and nonprofit becomes much more blurred, and where we actually pay visionaries and innovators the wages that they deserve to solve complex social problems the way we pay them to solve complex non-social problems.
Yeah.
So that we can really begin to solve some of these problems forever. And, I long for the day when nonprofit leaders ask every day, how am I working myself out of a job today? And is the work I'm doing today going to result in me not needing to be needed in this position anymore? And that boards will do the same thing, and that donors will do the same thing, and people will stop giving money to organizations that aren't systemically and sustainably solving problems as a challenge to them to think more critically, to think more deeply, and to move into more complex long-term solutions. So that's all that is kind of wrapped up in my book, Disrupting for Good.
Chris, there are 100 things tumbling around inside my mind right now, and I guess the first, maybe the most obvious one is: do you feel like you are meeting that standard yourself? We visited privately a little bit about this, but where is Mercy Project in terms of evolving to a place where it is self-sustaining, it can function without you? Talk a little bit about the challenges that you've dealt with in meeting that standard and going on that journey with this nonprofit.
Yeah, I think one of the things for every, especially international nonprofit, is for us to be really honest about how are we empowering the people from that local community to be the problem solvers of their own local problem versus us barging in and trying to bring solutions that may or may not be relevant to that cultural context. And I think that the Western world, in America in particular, at times in history, we've done a pretty bad job of bursting into contexts of not our own and saying, hey, there's one clear way how to do this, and it's this way. And that local culture says, we don't know what you're talking about because that's not what we do here. And then we're surprised when it doesn't work. And we say, well, can you believe that? What? That's so crazy. It's like, yes, I can believe that group of people who had no context did not do things like you did things in a completely different place. So that was one of our big initiatives at the very beginning of Mercy Project, was how do we empower Ghanaians to solve their own problem? And to that end, I do feel like we've been successful. We were about 6 years old when our last Americans on the ground in Ghana left. And for the last 4 years, we've been completely Ghanaian run on the grounds in Ghana. And but that didn't happen by accident. That happened because from the day we started hiring our first staff, we were identifying the leaders that would be our on the grounds leaders. And we started developing them and saying that to them. Hey, we see massive potential in you. And some of them, that scared off. Some of them thought, oh, that's too big for me. I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. And they didn't stick around. And then other ones, it empowered them even more. They got excited about that idea. So that's one of the first things. So in that role, we have about 18 staff at Mercy Project, 15 Ghanaians and 3 Americans. All 3 Americans, including myself, are here in the U.S., and the 15 Ghanaians are on the grounds in Ghana. So from that standpoint, yes, I think we've been very successful. Now, the challenge Mercy Project is going to face in the next few years is the challenge every startup, for-profit or nonprofit, faces, which is how do we extract the founder, the visionary, the leader from the day-to-day operations and allow the organization to still be successful. That's TBD. Mm-hmm. So I have a great team around me, but the truth is that I'm still the bottleneck in a lot of the work that we do. I'm the key relationship with a lot of our donors. I'm the key storyteller. I'm often the burst of energy that people are looking for when it comes to Mercy Project. So I think that's something we're going to be working through in the next couple of years or even sooner. And it's something that's very much on my mind as something that's going to have to be solved. But again, that's not a new dilemma. Even for-profits have to face that dilemma and just be really honest with themselves. Some people are creators. Some people are sustainers. And at some point, an organization reaches a place where it doesn't need somebody constantly breaking things to recreate them, but it needs somebody to smooth out the road so that more people can go on it. So we're getting close to that point. And I really want to do right by Mercy Project when we get to that point.
The other thing that I wonder about is, obviously, impacting even one life in this way is enormous. Is it possible to, what kind of scale is possible for something like this?
In Ghana particularly?
Any way you want to describe it? Yeah,
I think scale should always be possible. We shouldn't build things that don't scale. That should be a very early on. That should be an honest question that we ask ourselves is, are we building something? It doesn't mean we have to scale it. Maybe we're not the right people, or maybe we're not the right group. But to put in the kind of effort it takes to create anything from nothingness, you may as well take those 2, 3, 4 extra steps. A lot of times it's not even extra steps. It's just intentional, the same steps with more intention to say, look, we don't know where this is going, but let's build it as though it's going huge so that if it does get to that point, we don't have to tear it back down and rebuild it from the very beginning. So, like Mercy Project right now, we're absolutely at a place where we're ripe for scale. If Bill Gates listens to this podcast, Bill, we're sitting here, $10 million, a one-time gift of $10 million, and I could have all 7,000 kids off of Lake Volta reunited back with their families in the next 5 years. It's there. The fishermen make more money with the cages that we've taught them how to use than by using the labor of the children. We understand the challenges of reuniting children back into their families. We've done it successfully. 207 children now that we've rescued and reintegrated back into their families. None of them have been re-trafficked. The challenges are known. And so now it is at a place of scale. But I think every organization, for-profit or nonprofit, should always be asking themselves the question, are we building this to scale? Doesn't mean we have to, but let's at least give ourselves that option if we are to get to that point.
Yeah. Chris, how has your faith guided you throughout all this?
Yeah, I mean, if it weren't for my faith, I would have never started Mercy Project in the first place. When I read the book about child trafficking, we were pregnant with our first baby, a little girl. We knew we were going to name her Micah. And we've been praying over my wife's belly every day that this little girl would be a woman of justice and mercy, from Micah 6:8. And then I'm reading this book about child trafficking, and I'm thinking, wow, what kind of dad would I be if I'm praying that my unborn daughter is going to be a woman of justice, and yet I'm not willing to model for her what that actually looks like? I mean, what kind of dad would I be to hope and even pray for something in her life that I'm not willing to even live out in my own life? And so I had to deal with that contrast right there as I read about the children in Ghana. And for me in that moment, I thought, I don't know that I'm going to be able to really make a difference in Ghana, because I didn't know anything about it. It felt too big. It felt too complex. And I thought, someday my daughter's going to look at me and she's going to say, Dad, when you found out there were children that were slaves, what did you do? And I didn't want to have to look away when I answered that question for her. And I grew up here in the South. My father was in first grade in Bryan, Texas, when his school was integrated. And I know a lot of really, really good-hearted, kind people that are at a place that when conversations about integration and segregation and civil rights come up, it's not a conversation they're proud to have. And they do feel like they need to look away when they're asked, hey, what did you do when you saw two different water fountains? And what did you do when people of a different color had to sit in a different part of the restaurant than you? And kind of this, well, that's just the way it was. That's not going to work for our kids. Like Gen Z and Gen X and millennials are like, nah, sorry. Like, I'm not giving you a pass on that. And so for me, I was like, I don't fault anybody. Everybody's on their own personal journey. But for me, I thought, I wasn't around during the civil rights movement. And I'd like to think I would have done certain things. But it's one thing to read a book and think you would have done a certain thing in class and then go on with your life. It's something altogether to read about child slaves and think, wait, maybe this is my thing. Like, maybe this is that one thing my kids are going to ask me about. And so for me, that's when I really had to ask, like, is my faith something that happens in church? Is my faith something that happens in bedtime prayers? Or is my faith who I am as a human being? And is it something I'm willing to live out, even when it might cost me something severely? And what is faith without the chance that it might cost you something severely? I mean, it's not really faith. And so, so certainly faith has completely informed every part of my journey, not just from childhood all the way through to now, but particularly this journey with Mercy Project, that I would have never been able to, I would have never chosen to take that risk if it hadn't been for my faith informing me in the first place.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was thinking about this idea of discernment. So we decide to take certain actions and we decide not to take certain actions. And it's interesting as I think about Ghana, of all places, that, God orchestrated it such that you were reading the book right at the time you were having your daughter and you were prompted to do something about it. But there's so many people who might pick up on something in this discernment area and they might miss the beat, right? There's a moment when God gives you something to do. I talk about it in Run Toward Your Goliaths, the book that I just released. And we talk about this decision-making part of it, how God will give you an assignment at an appointed time. And some people just miss that beat. They miss those opportunities. So I applaud you for really digging in as God was prompting you to do this. And you did it in a big way, and you're making a big difference. I often think about, the old saying, you can give a person a fish and they eat for a day, or you can teach them how to fish and they'll eat for a lifetime, right? And that's what you and the Mercy Project have done, right? Is you're actually teaching people how to survive in a very critical area. So I applaud you for that, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and my take on the discernment conversation, just for what it's worth, is I feel a little baffled sometimes by kind of what has become the evangelical American response to discernment about whether something should or shouldn't be done. I feel sort of confused, which would be to put it nicely. I feel a little confused. Really, I feel annoyed, if I'm being honest. People will say something like, and I'm not picking on anybody, but people will say something like, I saw this homeless guy digging through a trash can, and, I really wanted to pray about whether or not I should be helpful to him. And I'm like, man, I feel very clear in most of Scripture that decision was already made.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like God's directive was very clear, to us. And so sometimes I feel like we overthink this because we try to create unnecessary processes or, some layers of, I don't know what it is, but, I really feel like Scripture is pretty clear. When people are in pain, we're to run towards them instead of away from them. And that might be the arc of all of Scripture in a sentence, right? Is when people are in pain, run towards them, not away. And so I feel confused sometimes when I hear people say, gosh, my friend's mom had cancer and she couldn't pay her deductible. And we had this money we'd set aside for, to give at the end of the year. And it happened to be really similar to what she needed. And so, we're going to pray over. It's like, hey, that's fine. I mean, that's fine if that makes you feel better. But that feels like a really clear opportunity for you that you're probably never going to regret, And so I just want to encourage people that are listening, when you see something in the world, some pain that you have the tools to solve or to fix, that's probably the discernment you need, is that you saw pain and you have tools to help alleviate that pain. And it's probably okay in most every one of those cases to just go ahead and walk towards that pain as a person willing to enter that darkness with someone else without needing a month-long prayer retreat to decide if God would will you to help the person in front of you that clearly needs help. So that.
Well, if we're made in God's image, that has to be a sensible answer almost all of the time.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well, how do we keep up with you, Chris? How do we stay in contact with you and all these great things that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm on all the various socials that people might have. My handle is Disruption Chris. My books are available on Amazon. I do a fair amount of speaking if people are interested in that. And I have a website that most of that runs through, just called meetchrisfield.com. And yeah, otherwise, I'm happy to connect with anybody that's listening, and certainly just grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit of my story. And I'm grateful for the work that you've done and you continue to do in challenging people to face those giants and to believe that they were made for those moments of courage, and that those things don't happen in spite of our weakness, but actually because of that. And no one's equipped to do the hard, important work that so many of us find ourselves called to do. And that's kind of the whole point, is I talk about in my second book, A Billion Hours of Good, that for me, the definition of courage is showing up, without knowing what's going to happen. And I believe so deeply that in a world where so many people are afraid to even show up, that just being willing to lace up our shoes and walk out the front door every day with no idea what's going to happen is one of the most courageous things that we can do. And that when we put ourselves out there and we make ourselves available and open, good stuff happens. Amen. And God is near, and God is faithful, and God is good. And I don't have all the answers, but I believe those three things to be true. And so I hold on to them. on the good days and on the bad days and everywhere in between. And so far, that seems to have served me pretty well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, Ben, for co-hosting this episode of Victory Groove. You just remember now, we already have the victory. We know the end game. We just need to get our groove back.